So, good evening, everyone. Are we good to go here, Lee, with the next step on this?
Yes, we are.
All right.
Looking forward to it.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kevin Bone. I've had the privilege of being involved with the Wright-Ingraham Institute for, I think, about 45 years now, maybe a couple more if I count when I first met the founder. It is just a thrill for me to continue to serve this institution and its aspiring ideals. I want to thank Lee, our new executive director, for all of her help in getting to this speaker series program that we have. This is our inaugural series in the speaker series, generally falling under the umbrella of design, ecology, and justice. Tonight's program is on interdisciplinary approaches to environmental education. We have three incredible speakers that have generously agreed to join us. Dr. Ted Hola, Dr. Melinda Laituri, and Dr. David Orr. I will introduce each of them individually before they speak. The basic model for tonight's program will be 3 short presentations by our primary speakers, and then leaving us some time for discussion and questions at the end. I would like to provide a little background and a short introduction, and then we'll try to get to the speakers. We're having a little bit of a tech issue on the other side, but I think it will be resolved. So Amos, if you could provide me the next slide. So in 2015, the Wright-Ingraham Institute collaborated with the Cooper Union Institute of Sustainable Design to do a 2-day workshop that we called Teaching Towards Sustainability. Next slide. No, back one, Amos, please. So we gathered 11 environmentally focused educational programs to examine what they had in common, how they differed, what their positions are in this complex question of how we teach towards sustainability. Next slide, please. So these 11 groups that we gathered together ranged from K-12 educational programs to groups doing advanced research with postdocs. Next slide, please. We, for a couple of days, examined our own approaches. We heard from our participants what was working and what was not working. And with any good academic gathering, one could imagine that consensus was hard to come by, but we did manage to leave with a couple of messages. Next slide, please. All agreed that education was key to tackling the questions of sustainability and the dilemmas of the 21st century. We agreed that we need to explore and test more models. We agreed that we need to reach for a broader base in all ways, diverse ages, disciplines, and communities. And we agreed that our means must adapt to local conditions. So I thought all of this was a pretty good beginning. This was to say that environmental education does not just belong in higher education in the elite universities of the Western world. It means it has to happen at all places, at all levels, in all communities. Next slide, please. One of the things that the Cooper Union Institute for Sustainable Design did was to craft and sponsor a summer challenge fellowship called Visualizing Climate Change. This was intended to engage people from all of the primary schools at Cooper Union in the pursuit of understanding environment in general, ecological literacy, and in communication and communicating our understanding of environment. Next slide, please. So this work involved the sort of higher end strategies of imagining our world, Jeff Orlowski's incredible film, Chasing Ice, was brought in and viewed several times. Next slide, please. But then on the level of student work, we began to see strategies, in this case, GIS presentations of various data sets, temperature anomalies, vegetation covers, snowpack accumulation, and other data sets, more or less typical GIS work, but done in a creative and inspired way. This was all done by engineers, by the way. Next slide, please. And then they accumulated this and made certain conclusions. Next slide, please. The work also included what we called the Cooper Union Institute for Sustainable Design Glacier Folio Project. This was an effort to consolidate the data on primary ice fields around the work into a unified graphic set so we could see how the ice fields were diminishing. So next slide, please. So in this particular model, you see the little key down below. This is one of the glacier fields at the very northern shoulder of South America. And the different tones of gray indicate different time periods beginning at 1900 and to the present. And the most bright white segments that are highlighted with the little line around them are the remaining ice of those fields. And across the board, this was the information that we were finding. Now, this is all out there, but the aspiration of the students who put this together was to, like I said, unify the data and unify the graphics so that they could all be compared. And the hope was to continue to update these. Next slide, please. But what was really inspiring in this work was this particular project here that was done by an art student and an engineering student who collaborated to say that, you know, we can't necessarily use the methods that are familiar to us, the GIS, the filmmaking, the high-end computer graphics to communicate these questions of climate change to a lot of the world. And Mizamur, the student who had worked on this project from engineering, was from Bangladesh. And he pointed out correctly that there are tens of millions of people with no connection to electricity, no access to television, computers, newspapers, any of the primary data sets. Next slide, please. But he did indicate that they have this tradition of making these naski kantas, which is a traditional embroidery that's used as an archive of community lore. And they imagined that this language of these embroideries could be used to communicate with the delta, the low-lying delta families that are detached from all of these systems, the nature of the changing world. And they kind of invented their own pictorial language that was consistent with the Bengali strategy. And to me, that was a kind of symbol of the range of strategies that we have to use to teach to environment. So with that note, I'm going to move on and introduce our first speaker. So Dr. Ted Hola has had a distinguished career as an educator and practitioner in urban and regional planning and other related subjects, with a particular specialty in indigenous planning. Since 1980, Ted has taught at the University of New Mexico, where he has served as Director of Native American Studies from 1980 to 1996, Acting Director of the Community and Regional Planning Program in 1995 and 96, and Director of that program in 2004 and 2005. From 2007 to 2009, he was visiting distinguished professor in the School of Geographic Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University. In 2011, he founded the Indigenous Design and Planning Institute at the University of New Mexico and is currently its director. He is actively involved in major research projects on Indian education, indigenous community development, and architecture. Dr. Hola has co-edited 3 books and has published numerous articles and chapters on topics related to Indigenous design and planning, stereotyping, and economic development. It's been a pleasure to meet Ted and work to get to this point over these last few meetings, and I'm happy to welcome him to the Wright-Ingraham Institute Speaker Event Series. Ted.
Thank you for that. Greetings from the Pueblo of Isleta here in New Mexico. I'd like to say we're 7 lucky minutes south of Albuquerque, if you don't know the geography of the place where I'm at. But unfortunately, urbanization has caught up with us, and it takes more like 20 minutes. Well, that said, I'd like to go ahead in my presentation and opening remarks. If you can go to the next slide, please. So I want to start out with this concept of place knowing, and this has actually evolved from conversations that we have had nationally with various indigenous communities who have been working on projects dealing with placemaking. You're probably familiar with that particular kind of initiative. It kind of evolved out of regards to looking at how it is that the life and death of great cities and kind of concerns around placemaking and economics and borderless regions. But from our perspective, we really began to build a conversation around the fact that placemaking as a concept itself was really not attuned to our own kind of place-based experience, that in fact, many of the people basically commented that our places were actually made already, and that what we're dealing with is what it is that we've inherited. So this particular model here shows essentially what we use as a way to discuss 7 generations planning. The idea that communities that have evolved in place and time over successive generations essentially have to evolve what is a distinctive kind of worldview, which is their understanding of how it is that they are in the places that they are and how it's really evolved into this way that is sustained through generations. So this typifies my area river. You've got the verdant cottonwood grove forest in the green, but you've got then the water. And those of you that have come to New Mexico probably say, well, that's not much grand about that river. But in fact, you only see 10% in the surface water and 90% is actually underground. So it's really as a result of modernization and being able to tap into that groundwater then that we can sustain this kind of grid pattern as opposed to the gravity flow pattern that had sustained us through generations in terms of surface agriculture. Temperate climate, mountains are a water reservoir. In the spring, when the thaw comes, then it sustains us. And now we're in the monsoon season, so at the end of our crops, then that sustains us as well too. But place knowing really then comes out of the idea that because we don't make our places, that we inherit them, that what it is that's really important is being able to know the places and understand traditions read from our ancestors and how we use that as a way to help inform these things into the future in terms of our own visiting, positioning, growth, and development. So place knowing then really is amplified by many of our elders who said that our task and our role on this earth is to walk with our children and learn the meaning of our places, learn the stories, learn these connections, and that it's these things which then sustain our culture, our language, and make us singular in terms of what our identity is. Next slide. Next slide. So the circle is really an important element of what it is that we look for in terms of looking at cycle and life completion. And we've worked with communities in terms of how is it that we actually model this. Next slide. So we attribute this kind of modeling as based on what it is that we can map out in terms of taking a circle and moving it horizontally on its axis, and then taking a tangent point, which began the part of our beginning of our life cycle. And as we then move it through that time continuum, we then complete that life cycle in a way then that brings us from our birth to our death. Next slide. I'm sorry, but there was a actual graphic that was animated there, but it doesn't seem to be coming up. But what I wanted to share with you then is that if you understand that circularity and how it is then that it maps out this sine curve, which is this red image that you see here. And in a conversation with the Isleta del Sur Pueblo in El Paso, we had a community discussion about what were the kind of values that were really important in terms of the quality of life and participation, in terms of their quality of participation in the community. And as they then map this out from birth to death, then you see that first people learn meaning, their values, and then they learn language. As teenagers, then they assume their role in terms of tradition, their roles in the community, skills, and then they assume positions as adults, learn responsibility, leadership, parenting. And then as they grow into elders, then they maintain this, continue connection, pass on tradition, knowledge keepers, and then build that connection with the youth so that as ultimate teachers, they pass that on to the next generation. So how it translates then was to simply ask them how it is that their institutions, which they currently maintain, help to support that life journey. So that horizontal line then shows how that institutions are actually staged. So they have a program for early child, they have a nation building program for their teens, they have a multi-generational place program for their adult learners. And then in terms of their sustainability as an agriculture community, then they have gardens and landscaping. And then finally, they were actually looking at the possibility of developing a senior activity center. So that's the basic way of taking this concept of how it is that we deal with life completion, how of this life cycle, but then matching it actually with the kind of institutions that support it. So I wanted to share that because I think that when we talk about sustainability, we really have to look at it much more from the long term in terms of generational modeling, that in some instances, when we begin things, it's not necessarily the case that we live long enough to actually see them to their completion, but that over the generations, what is it that's so compelling that we can pass on to those children that will finish our projects that end up in a real coherent and masterful way of continuing our communities in the kind of way that is really important to us in terms of the culture and value that sustain us. So with that, thank you, and I'll pass it on to the next presenter.
Ted, thank you so much. That was wonderful, absolutely clear. And like I said, it's just such a privilege to have you contributing to our efforts here. Look forward to getting to know you more and to know more about your work as time goes on. So I am going to introduce our next presenter, Dr. Melinda Leitori is a professor emeritus of geography in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability at Colorado State University. She is the founding director of the Geospatial Centroid at CSU. a unit that provides support for geospatial research and teaching across the university. She is a Fulbright Scholar, having taught GIS at the University of Botswana and conducted research in the Center for Scientific Research, Indigenous Knowledge, and Innovation on participatory mapping and conservation planning. Professor Laitouri is a Rachel Carson Fellow for Environment and Society at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich and is a founding member of the Center for Environmental Justice. She is a visiting scientist at the Center for Geographic Analysis at Harvard University, and she has been very helpful to us in getting to this point. Thank you, Melinda, and look forward to hearing from you.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
So thank you for the invitation to present today. I will talk about field data collection as an aspect of environmental education that exemplifies the interdisciplinary approaches. I want to consider the expansive landscape of environmental education, so beyond the university, within communities, and around the world. Data collection is inherently interdisciplinary, but we seldom discuss this aspect of environmental education and research. As a geographer, I work with spatial data, geographic information systems, creating visualizations through maps. So data is the backbone of science. Science is one of the foundational aspects of knowledge building. Culture is the filter through which we assess, evaluate, and assimilate outcomes based upon our research, data, and science. So it's complicated. Next slide, please. This is a photo of where I live. I work with students in the field, and my responsibility is to teach them to read the landscape. Reading the landscape is based on observation, experience, and learning. This is the Cache-la-Poudre River. Is this a natural landscape? A segment of this river is designated a wild and scenic river, and I emphasize segment. This river is a legacy landscape where human impact has redesigned the river to function in a very particular way. A conduit to supply water, primarily for cities and agriculture. The river has been impacted by changing conditions that rapidly accelerated after the Native Americans were forced to leave traditional and seasonal sites across the Rocky Mountains. Hunting and trapping decimated the beaver population that dramatically increased river flows. Deforestation contributed to increased erosion due to mining, forestry, grazing in the high mountain meadows, and downstream economies. The river channel was dynamited to expand and accommodate logs to float in the emerging Front Range communities, and the railroad and highways to open the high country to further settlement, reorganizing the landscape. So I ask the question again, is this a natural landscape? Next slide, please. This is a similar stretch of the river today. We experienced devastating fires last summer where the sky was dark with ash for days and the river runs black with sediment due to the extensive loss of vegetation. The fires are a combination of climate change conditions, mismanagement over many years, and a reconfigured forest of secondary growth after the massive logging at the turn of the last century. So these photos represent a legacy of the past as well as adaptations occurring today that will transform the forests of the future. Reading the landscape is about understanding the processes we observe and collecting data to refine our understanding of these processes, such as river flows, erosion patterns, vegetation density, as well as policy and management decisions and community local knowledge. Next slide, please. So with this background as context, looking at my backyard, I want to discuss field-based data collection, how this informs interdisciplinary approaches to education. There's a relationship between the decisions we make about going into the field and collecting data, the purpose informed by background research, and situating our efforts within the system we are examining. The science, how we collect data, is increasingly driven by the technologies we use, as well as the methods, sampling strategies, and tools. We're challenged to apply holistic thinking to understand the relationships across scales and across boundaries. And we then must figure out how to communicate with each other. What language do we use? How do we find a common language? Next slide, please. So this is an example of holistic thinking from Kenya, Africa. by scaling up and down within the context of policy for water management, from the global to the community, or is it the community to the global? This is not a linear process. There are numerous feedback loops and cascading impacts of policy decisions. We spent time working with local communities in the field to collect data on water use and needs to better inform policy built upon the fundamental concept that water is a human right. Next slide, please. This is an example of strategic science and technology. The digital environment provides a large amount of data that can inform environmental research and education. Existing data is increasingly available and has grown exponentially over the past several decades, where global and national data sets are rich resources for examining resource availability, land use, land cover change, population growth, examining the nightlights data, and climate change trends. My university colleagues have expressed concern with the emphasis on digital tools and the utility of virtual environments. Will field work become compromised? I would say no. What is lacking in all of this flood of digital data is data at the local scale, particularly in middle income and lower income countries where I do much of my work. Next slide, please. A driver of collecting better environmental data at the local scale are a number of integrative tools and technologies that enable us to create seamless data sets, cross scales and boundaries, and enable the participation of local communities. While the World Wide Web can provide us with access to existing data and increasing availability of satellite imagery, it is limited due to the comments that Kevin made at the beginning that not everybody has access to these tools. But what people do have access to increasingly are a number of different types of mobile tools, whether it's a mobile phone or other kinds of applications that have been created to engage with local communities in a way that we can get better data collected from our partner communities through GPS and mobile phones, and using integrated platforms such as geographic information systems, which have open source platforms now for making these technologies more accessible. However, this is a fraught endeavor. Issues of access and equity are still present. The language of the internet and these tools are largely English, and the digital databases are conceptually limiting. Remember, we agreed to reduce everything to zeros and ones. Next slide, please. But we do have a number of new methods to enhance collaboration, increasing community participation through participatory mapping and intercultural dialogues. Local community knowledge informs critical environmental concerns, needs, and assists in identifying local priorities for resource management, as well as understanding places and reflecting upon what Ted shared with us. Culture plus spaces equals places. Next slide, please. These are some examples of participatory mapping and field data collection where each of these communities were included in data collection to address local issues related to climate change. The Yukon River Delta in Alaska, we mapped changing subsistence patterns during winter. Across Mongolia, we mapped changing patterns of herders. And in Botswana, we examined conservation strategies for traditional plants. Fine scale local data using sketch maps, a field data collection using GPS and mobile tools, focus groups and interviews allowed us to collect community level data. Next slide, please. I'm almost done. We use this baseline data to transpose data onto satellite images and integrate data across systems and ways of knowing. Our aim is threefold: to address critical environmental issues at a community level, to build capacity and participation through environmental education and technology for local communities and universities, and to make better decisions based on integrated data about the environment. Next slide, please. These data can be made accessible in open source platforms to complement other existing data, such as OpenStreetMap. OpenStreetMap has fueled a global interest in community mapping and the collection of local community data, primarily buildings, roads, and infrastructure. For example, we've been mapping water points in an informal settlement in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to assess the access to water during the pandemic. An important note, None of this data collection, all of this data collection is done with the permission of the communities we work with. No sensitive, personal, cultural, spiritual data are included unless communities want to do that, but that's another talk. And to my last slide. An outcome of these kinds of activities, participatory mapping, improving environmental education, the need for local data is the establishment of Youth Mappers, an international university consortium that has chapters at universities around the world, collecting geospatial and environmental data on environmental issues, working across cultures and languages, and setting the stage for the future. And back to my neighborhood. We have teams of students collecting data after the fire and floods, using these same tools and mapping techniques to gather environmental data on river flows and interviews community groups to discuss recovery and adaptation. And I end on an optimistic note. I have the great privilege to work with young people around the world, and they are amazing. I think we might just be okay. So with that, thank you.
Melinda, that was simply incredible. You know, I know when we first talked to you that you were so inspired about teaching, and one can really feel it in every slide here. And I was also so nervous about asking all of you to speak for 15 minutes, but you did a great job of putting all your material together there. Thank you so much. I look forward to, I hope, what is a fruitful collaboration with the Wright-Ingraham Institute. So, I will now introduce our third and final speaker, David Orr, Dr. David Orr. David is Paul Sears Distinguished Professor of Environmental Studies and Environmental Studies and Politics, Emeritus and Senior Advisor to the President of Oberlin College. He's founding editor of the journal Solutions, and founder of the Oberlin Project, a collaborative effort of the city of Oberlin, Oberlin College, and private and institutional partners to improve the resilience, prosperity, and sustainability of Oberlin. While at Oberlin, he spearheaded the effort to design, fund, and build the Adam Joseph Lewis Center, which was named by an AIA panel in 2010 as the most important green building of the past 30 years. And by the US Department of Energy as one of the 30 milestone buildings of the 20th century. Orr is the author of 8 books, including Dangerous Years, Climate Change, The Long Emergency and the Way Forward, and Down to the Wire, Confronting Climate Collapse. I would also add to that list of books, one that was very influential when I was first working at this, and that was called Earth and Mind. When my dean at Cooper Union asked me who we should be reading about environmental education, I said David Orr. David has helped us a number of times at Cooper, and I'm glad that he's here. We've had a few technical problems, and he's joining us with voice only. David, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, great. Welcome.
Kevin, thank you so much. And to all of you, I apologize for a computer meltdown that occurred just recently. So I'm having to come by phone. And you'll have to bear with me without slides, which throws me back on just simply audible communication here. Let me say, first of all, it's a real pleasure to be with Melinda and Ted. And sorry we can't meet in person, but both your presentations were very impressive, and I appreciate the work that you do, and I'll try to build on what you have laid out. Kevin gave us about 12 or so questions to focus on. It's a great list, and I'm going to try to skim through that as I talk, but I want to make a couple of points to begin with. I think the focus for this discussion, or any discussion about education, is the problem of education, not problems in education. And that means that I think we are in some ways, as a group of educators, implicit or complicit in the crisis that's breaking on our heads right now. And I'll say more about that in just a minute. The issues which I found most compelling in education, the problem of education, was that for many students, it's simply too abstract. And it didn't connect head, hands, and heart in any very fundamental way. Oftentimes, they left after 4 years or 6 years of higher education, confused about where they fit in the world. One of the things that Kevin asked us to talk about was the systems approach to education, and that is also very difficult because that's an abstract kind of thing. How do we encourage young people to see the world whole? And I appreciate very much Ted's work in this regard, going back to indigenous cultures and their capacity to live within the boundaries of nature and see things connected. The point of all this is simply to say that all education is environmental education. By what we include or exclude, we teach young people they're part of or a part from the natural world. As for goals, I think our goal collectively is to make students dangerous to the system that is rapidly changing the climate and destroying ecosystems all over the world. We need young people who understand that the world is not headed in a sustainable or good direction, and it's going faster in the wrong direction than we ever anticipated. The climate chaos now, we're warmer now than we've been at the planetary scale for 800,000 years or a bit longer. And this is not a solvable issue in the way we typically think about solutions. This is a long emergency. So what do we do? How do we teach? And I'm going to skim through that. Much of what I'm saying or will say is based on the list of questions that Kevin gave us. But let me describe 3 things. In nearly 30 years ago now, we started a project at Oberlin that Kevin mentioned, the Adam Joseph Lewis Center. The program in which I was teaching, the environmental studies program, had no focal point, no office and space, and no place for students to gather. And so we organized an effort with somewhat reluctant administration, but we organized an effort to design and build an environmental studies center. And in doing this, we made this pedagogical. We typically are not engaged in the design of the places in which we teach or learn. But in this case, we wanted to do something different. We wanted to make this building educational. So we assembled a series of 13 design charrettes. About 250 students came in to that process, and they began to lay out the design of a building that was powered entirely by sunshine. I'm in northern Ohio, where we have as many sunny days roughly as the city of Seattle does, and in Germany for that matter. They wanted a building that purified all its wastewater, so the standard was drinking water in, drinking water out. They wanted a building that used no toxic materials, and so forth and so on. Down the list of building criteria that are now part of the U.S. Green Building Council's Platinum Standard. And this is before there was a U.S. Green Building Council or a Platinum Standard for that matter. We assembled a design team around that. The design team included 14 agencies, NASA, 2 architectural firms, Amory Levin's group in Colorado, Carolyn Franklin's landscape design group in Philadelphia. We had engineers and architects and lighting experts and so forth. And the criteria for them was to work with our students. And the point of this was to have them roll up their sleeves and work with designers and begin to understand how you design a building as a system. So in terms of thinking of systems, the goal of the building design was, as they put it, to cause no ugliness, human or ecological, somewhere else or at some later time. So you think upstream from the building, the forests and farms and mines and wells and so forth, where the material flow begins. And then downstream from that project, in terms of climate change and greenhouse gases and biotic impoverishment and extinction of species. So the goal was a very large goal, one you can never really reach, but one that we set out to get as close to as we possibly could. So in the making of that building, the building was opened in year 2000. It became a laboratory for the design of solutions in an 1.25 acre setting and a 14,200 square foot building. The landscape was designed to restore the native vegetation that had once existed on that site, as well as to be a working landscape with orchards and gardens and composting systems and so forth. The building is now in its 21st year. It is powered entirely by sunlight, with about a 25 to 40% surplus in any given year. The wastewater system has worked beautifully. We operated what looks like from the outside a greenhouse. But what that building did was to take in a small scale and show young people who were looking at a world coming undone, how do we get the pieces back together again in a way that was very tangible. And in doing this, they worked with a remarkable design team. They read material safety data sheets, and they have all kind of long words about chemicals that some 260 are in the typical teenager's body now, and carcinogenic and mutagenic and endocrine disruptors and so forth. But they began to see the world as hopeful, and a world that could be powered by sunshine at a scale that they could comprehend. And more important, they were part of it. So if hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up, they rolled up their sleeves to work on this project. They've gone off, one of the things I'm most proud of is what they've gone off to do. Generations of students have been educated in the building, participated in its ongoing management and evolution and so forth. The rest of the story includes the Oberlin project, which engaged several hundred students also in taking what we learned about ecological design up to the scale of a small town of 9,000 people, Oberlin, Ohio, just southwest of Cleveland by about 35 miles. So the idea here was to simply take what we learned up to the scale of a small town, learn the politics of it, the educational issues of it. That project had a major impact on rebuilding much of the downtown, including the design and building of a 105,000 square foot entirely solar powered hotel on that site that is a platinum rated building. And in both these cases, I think it was imperative to begin to build a curriculum around the concept of applied hope, along with the technical competence, the kind of skills that Melinda was describing and Ted is familiar with, the kind of skills that make people competent in rebuilding the world. They face a world and changes so rapid and so awesomely destructive if allowed to go much further. So they've got to be dangerous to that system. I want to describe one last thing before I close. I began to work at Schumacher College some 20 years ago also, teaching courses there along with people like Fritjof Capra and Wes Jackson and people from all over the world. And Schumacher College is located on an old British estate out in Devon, about 4 hours by train west of London. The college itself is located in just a single building, an old gatehouse that had been built some centuries back. Had been adapted to be an educational center. What it serves, the purpose it serves is to provide kind of the equivalent of putting a compass on a table so that young people have time to sort out what's important and what's not important. It's time away from the academic environment of disciplines and classes and courses and course credits and graduation and so forth, but a place to go where you meet in small numbers around a series of very different kinds of courses and classes through the course of a year. And any given of the 15 or 20 classes that I taught or participated in, there'd be people from Bolivia and South Asia and Europe and the United States, all over at all ages. Some people were well into their 60s and some people who were government bureaucrats and so forth. But the point of that was to allow students an opportunity to get away from the campus and get away from the pressures of education, and to begin to sort through who they are and what they want to do with their lives, and to connect with other people in similar situations. A little bit like compare it to salt in the stew, small by volume, but very large by effect. It changes the flavor of the thing. And the students that I knew best that went to Schumacher College or similar kinds of experiences described it as life-changing. They had all the technical skills, but they lacked a sense of direction, a chance to rub shoulders with young people in a similar situation and older people from all kinds of backgrounds, as well as teachers in a very intensive learning environment. And the courses could last a weekend or a month, but they were small relative to the whole span of an academic career. But the point being to help them find direction in life and to overcome the despair. And let me close by saying this. I think for all of us in the educational world, we teach a generation of young people that are watching the curves go up or down, extinction rates higher than any in the past few million years. The new report out on climate change from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change several weeks ago shows that we're coming up to the final maybe decade or maybe 2 decades to avoid irretrievable catastrophe. And young people in facing these things, facing the science and the hard data, are, I think, tempted all too often to simply give up and go off in despair. And Melinda mentioned the great students that she has. I think that they want something more than simply careers. They want a cause, and they want a life that is connected to the big causes of the time, and saving a habitable planet and the ecosystems on the earth is going to be critically important for their lives and their work. And what else would they want to do anyway? That's the thing that we must do before it's too late. We're going down a highway and passing exit ramps very rapidly to better destinations than what is dead ahead. So I think that all of us in education, we're not the 8th most important thing or the 10th or 15th. We are the most important thing. The crisis we face is a crisis of how we think and how poorly we have sometimes thought about matters of great importance having to do with life and its preservation and justice and so forth. And then finally, we've taken this up to, we're starting a related kind of companion project at Arizona State University and Oberlin and 3 institutions in Denver, University of Denver and University of Colorado, Colorado State University, and so forth, engaging faculty in helping to equip students to be politically active in this. And the reason is that most everything environmental is ultimately political. It's how we decide who gets what, when, and how. And so it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm sorry again about my computer. I wish I could show you the slides, but this is more or less what the slides would have portrayed. It was 3 separate projects actively engaging students at a system level in ways that require the head, hand, heart collaboration, and then working with lots of other people doing the same things. So with that, I'll stop.
David, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm reminded of when I first read your book, Earth and Mind, and there was that phrase in there that all education is environmental. It's just that not all of it is towards a positive impact. And I thought that was fairly critical. And the idea that in everything we teach, from business to economics to agriculture, it has to be taking into account the environmental consequences, the ecological consequences. I think for conversation here, I'm also going to depart from or take off from your message of hope. I was reminded of, we have an advisor to the Wright-Ingraham Institute, Al Appleton, who helped us a lot in 2018 when we were setting this up. And he used to come into Cooper Union and lecture, and he was really good at just off the cuff describing environmental situations. And one day he gave one of his hour-and-a-half lectures or hour and 45-minute lectures about what was going on with the changing environment. And at the end of it, one of the students raised their hand and said, Al, how do you get out of bed in the morning? Because it was so grim, this sort of report of where we're at. And he said, come back next week. And we indeed all came back next week, and he proceeded to discuss things that were going on that were not going on 20 years ago. were not going on 30 years ago. The ways that we're teaching, the ways that we're thinking about watershed management, the way that we're thinking about soil health and restoration. And that was really important for the students. So I'm going to let the three of you maybe take on a little bit of discussion about our pedagogical model and how we can build hope and enthusiasm and not let the despair of the current situation just lead everyone to sit around and watch videos on the computer.
Well, maybe I can chime in right at this point. I think that I was really struck by what David said about hand and heart, which I think is really within this kind of connection that we're making with place knowing. And that I think, you know, this is one of the things that as we kind of immerse ourselves in these types of technologies, we somehow assume that just because we get exposed to lots of visuals and that somehow it serves as surrogates of actually walking the earth and using your hand and your heart and making that kind of connection. So, you know, if we're projecting it into, you know, how can our universities and how can our places adapt? We really need to build these kinds of better situations where, you know, we can deal with immersive kinds of experiences. For example, what Melinda outlined with her experiences in Alaska and Mongolia and Kenya. I've been to 2 out of the 3 places, and it just changed my worldview, you know, by actually being there. And I think, you know, that kind of experience is immeasurable in terms of how we can relate the concepts, especially from theory to abstract to real.
Yeah, I'll follow up with a comment also. I work on another big project that has to do with second order impacts of the pandemic. So looking at things that have to do with the lockdowns that occurred, what happened to the economy, what happens if you don't have access to health care, what happened when tourism shut down, you know, all of these kinds of things. And we have a number of students working on these projects with us. And what I've learned from this activity is there's kind of 3 things. One is the importance of geography. I think geography is central to what's going on with the pandemic. Second is the exposure of the extreme inequity and inequalities around the world that we need to take a look at and really examine. And the third is kind of the collapsing of the silos that we're in. We have to look at things in an integrated manner. We have to figure out how this can work across disciplines, because it is so necessary to come up with collective decisions that cross all these, that span all these different ways of looking at the world. So that's just a comment.
Yeah, let me follow that and say that that's a very powerful point, and I think students need that. The general thrust of the academy generally is to it's centripetal. It's to pull people into, including faculty mainly, into smaller and smaller segments of learning and publishing in frequently unread journals and so forth, and trying to connect young people with this idea of systems that Kevin asked us to talk about a bit. And Melinda, your point and Ted's point, I think, are central to this, and allowing them to see the world whole. And if there's a basis for hope, I think it is in seeing that the things that connect, the essential connectedness of life and so forth in their careers. And now I'd say last that I don't think it matters a great deal what career choice young people make. I think they can see it whole. So, for example, the law. One of the challenges of the law now, and particularly in the United States, is to extend the Constitution to include the rights of future generations and the rights of nature, and to see the law, that structure of rules and regulations in which we presumably live, as part and parcel of that larger world of life. And for business, it's the same thing. To begin to see businesses from the extraction to the disposal, extraction of materials to the disposal of their product someplace as part of a circular economy. And I think that's the challenge to our whole generation, is to begin a world that works as a whole system over the long term. And that's going to require difference. Kevin mentioned agriculture. Farming is going to be critical, how we grow food and how we manage forests in the same way. But the revolution of holism is a revolution of connectedness. And if you're inclined to be religious about these things, I think that's the core of most of the world religions. It's how do we connect to each other and how do we see the world whole.
I see that our president of the board, Catherine Ingram, has her hand up. So I think it is only appropriate that we hand the mic over to Kath.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions of some of the esteemed visitors to this event, which is great, or the speakers. And I wanted to ask more about the idea of places not being made but inherited that Theodore or Ted talked about. And I'm curious about how that plays out in a certain sense. Is it that place is never finally made, that it's always somehow moving in front of you or behind you or something, or that the inheritance of it goes back so many generations that you never finish, you never complete it. And so that is, of course, a radically different idea than the static character of place that is used by, city planners and so forth, urban planners who are thinking of, a specific and, property systems that talk about place in this bounded way. So I'm curious about how it works with the let's say the curatorial relationship to space that you have to have, especially in an environmental sense, how you would capture the space in order to curate it environmentally, so to speak, whether good or, for the good, hopefully, but or do we just leave it, or do we stand back from that? I'm just curious about that kind of path and what kind of system it is to inherit space as place rather than make it. If it is,
yeah. So thanks for that question, Catherine. One of my slides that crashed and burned in the presentation was because I use lots of animation. So unfortunately, sometimes they're not supported in different environments. But that said, there's a picture of Chaco to make this notion of generation. And those of you that have been fortunate to come to New Mexico know that it's a World Heritage environment and contains ancestral homelands for us. But one of the centerpieces of that is Pueblo Bonito, which epitomizes the best of traditional knowledge. It's got lunar solstices, solstice markers. There's a whole complexity with the Pleiades. There's all sorts of dualities that are attached there, so on and so forth. And it's got a very unique shape that is kind of like a half semicircle. But what is important about that is that people don't understand that that was not created overnight, that it actually took 140 years. And if you do the math, then that's approximately 20 years in terms of 7 phases, and the archaeological record actually shows how. So if the way that we work in imagine that we're undergoing that same kind of process, that you as a person of the middle generation, then who do you look for in terms of that knowledge from the past? Well, it's your parents, your grandparents, and your great-grandparents. And who is it that you project forward in terms of your vision? It's your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren. And in many of our discussions, when we're dealing with visioning with communities, almost inevitably all of them say we want a healthy community as their vision. So we remind them then, well, who are the voices in your community that can contribute to that discussion? Well, it's exactly all of those generations, because there's 7 there. And that one measure of whether or not you have a healthy community is that if they're all present in some form or fashion, they may not be directly related to you, but to somebody else, they have that relationship. So the wake-up moment in that conversation is to say, let's not talk about 5-year, 10-year, 25-year, 50-year timeframes. Those are all artificial. We believe in lazy math, so that's the kind of thing that we go towards. But instead, let's think of it in terms of generation and impact. And let's acknowledge the fact that those people who were the master planners at that point, when they initiated, knew that they were not going to live long enough to see its completion. So it took all those years and all those generations, and our discussion then shifts immediately to what is it that was so compelling, and how is it that they managed then to transfer that concept across these generations and actually never lose sight of what that objective was, and learning along the way, of course, as each adds on this excessive sense of knowledge to that kind of base. So I think, that in a nutshell talks about place knowing as a way to kind of think about the fact that if we don't walk that land and we don't do it with those that know the meanings, that, it just completely undercuts all of that knowledge that we need in order to not only recognize, but also move forward.
I just want to ask one more thing. Thank you. That was really really interesting. Also, sort of the temporal measurement of the generational is really interesting. That the way that, like, what that it's not a unit. It's a kind of it's something that doesn't break itself into years or whatever. So I think that's really interesting. I'm very interested in how in architecture, for example, we use precedent. I think of precedent as a kinship system. In other words, that it's a collection of some, group of mainly your architectural parents or your ancestors' collection of what seems valuable to retain, and then it's presented to you as a new person in the world, and you're supposed to connect somehow to that precedent in order to redesign the world through your own lens. But there's a piece to that I think is deeply connected to that kinship system of precedents. But I also think that there is a piece that has to be what I think Winnicott called creative omnipotence over the moment where you break with precedent and develop creatively. You play with the toy in a certain sense in the way you just want to at that time, which is it's a psychoanalytic analysis of how children learn to grasp their own, in a way, coming to their own maturity, is to have that creative omnipotence at some moment, which creates the culture eventually of the world. So I'm curious if there's a point where, let's say, we want where the generational influence is paused for a moment, and there's this this development of sort of this identity that is, you know, the self or whatever, whatever we want to call it. And I think that actually leads a little bit to David Orr's remarks too about defining, how students need to find themselves. And so how do you get them out into an environment where they can see things in a different way? And it's the same question in a sense. I mean, is that a kind of breaking with the generational sort of, influence for a period of time and then going back, because of course we're never free from that.
Kevin, that's very thoughtful. I don't have a good answer for that, but I would go back to the work of the Institute and so many other places. I mentioned Schumacher College just for diversity, but I think young people need to have time out to sort through what's important to them and what's not. And I think one of the brilliant things of Frank Lloyd Wright, by the way, I'm sitting in my office and my back window looks out on a Frank Lloyd Wright house here in Oberlin. It's about an 8-iron shot from me right through the yard. I think one of the great things about the great designers was they saw design as, in the large sense, design capital D. And the challenge to us, I think, in this particular time in human history is to begin to understand how do we take design from buildings or even neighborhoods up to the scale of regions and cities, and eventually the entire planet needs to be informed by smarter design that connects things and closes circles and cycles and lives within the way nature works. How do we calibrate a civilization with the way nature works at a physical system? And at the granular level, that's buildings and backyards and neighborhoods. At the total scale, it gets into world politics and how do we distribute wealth and so forth. I haven't answered the question, but I'm fascinated with the idea of taking design up to the next largest scale where it informs our infractions of the biogeochemical cycles, primarily now carbon dioxide and other heat-trapping gases.
David, we have an incredible question in the chat from a former alum of the Wright-Ingraham Institute Field Stations program, and it kind of ties into your answer, and I would like to take this opportunity to bring in some of these questions from the chat. So this is from Emma Potieritz, who was working with the Wright-Ingraham Institute, but was also a participant in 2019. And I'm going to take the liberty of reading this for you, Emma, since you're not up on the screen there. I think one of the things we struggle with as a capitalist society is an entrenched view of natural systems as static entities, as opposed to systems in constant flux from which humans are inseparable. Have you encountered educational tools, conceptually or technologically, that help students see change and interaction within the natural systems? And I'll just open this up to all three of you, to whoever might want to take Emma's question on. And thank you, Emma, for the question.
Well, let me take a crack at it. Emma, thanks for that question. And I think if you take the design in that sense, how do we design an economy that works within, not against, natural systems? And the writings of Herman Daly 50 years ago were really essential to this. Kate Rayworth more recently in her book Donut Economics, but there's a long shelf of very good books about how do we think about economics in that sense. And I would add only one other thought to this. In making of the Lewis Center or the hotel here in Oberlin and so forth, you had to ask a question: if something costs more initially, but it helped to lower the lifetime costs of a building, why not do it? I mean, it's just smart economics. But that's not the way we typically do anything in this economy. The short run prevails, and long issues of sustainability. And the point here is that we will pay one way or another for sustainable systems, whether we get them or not. We can pay now, or we can pay a lot more later in the context of war and so forth and so on. The last point related to that is this: we're just leaving Afghanistan in a awful mess, our exit. But why were we there in the first place? And we were there because we were so dependent on Middle Eastern oil. That was a design problem. We designed a transportation system that required oil from whatever source and wherever on the planet you could find it. And the world I remember vaguely was disappearing was a world of streetcars and local traffic and people on bicycles and walkable cities and so forth. And we can design that world again. It's not too late to do that and make it even better. But to design an economy that encourages us to do the right thing instead of the wrong thing. But Emma, that is obviously a very fertile question, and I'll leave it to others to elaborate.
So let me just reflect on one point that was made about this concept of static. I think, the complement to static is living. And it was kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier with regards to buildings. And if you kind of think about it, buildings from an indigenous design perspective are actually living entities. And one of my former colleagues and friends who's now passed on, Rena Swensel, probably made the most important connection with our traditional vernacular traditions here of Adobe, where houses are born from the earth, and then they nurture and they house the family, and it's almost organic the way that it grows. And as long as the family itself is vital, then it continues to sustain itself. But at the point when that family then begins to become smaller, either because the children move away or in cases where the children no longer live there and the place is abandoned, these houses go back to the earth and they complete a life cycle exactly the same way as I illustrated in one of the diagrams that I had there. So buildings are also living, and when you then ramp that up and say they can also be learning places because they have all these metaphorical aspects to it that bring their own meanings, especially if they're built from a collective kind of standpoint, then they're just more than space. And then when you kind of project that to the Oberlin example, the reason that building is probably so important is because it breathes and it rejuvenates and it provides this kind of healthy temperament as a living place, not as a dead space like we tend to try and build these notions of artificial spaces. So that concept of static versus living, I think, is a really important one to acknowledge in the design process.
All right.
I would just have a couple follow-up comments to that. One thing to think about, I study river systems, and something we talk a lot about in river systems is restoration. And I don't think restoration exists. I think what we're always doing is we're doing redesign. We're redesigning river systems all the time. We're never going to restore them to whatever condition we think about. And so the language we use and how we talk about these things is very important. And I think we have an opportunity now to use language in a very powerful way in terms of really applying these concepts we talk about. What does resiliency mean in this age? What does things like these wicked problems represent? How do we talk about adaptation in this century? All of these things that are these powerful terminology, but I don't think we use the language in a way that's as dynamic as it could be for the young people we work with. We need to make this stuff alive. We don't need to make it something that they don't understand or to obscure it any longer. And so I think this idea of restoration versus redesign is very important.
Melinda, I would only say that just amen to what you've just said so well. Words matter. And a good bit of the muddle of civilization has been because the use of language is so sloppy. And that's a insight that we owe to George Orwell nearly a century ago now.
All right, I'm going to bring one more question up from the chat box here. I love the direction this is going, and we can keep going as long as everybody has some energy, but I want to share some of this time with people that have taken the time to put questions in. This is from Barbara Arundel. Hi, Barbara, nice to see that you've joined us. Barbara asked, any of the presenters have some help with the fact that there is no time for incremental change, that ecological environmental changes have hit tipping points and that are signaling there is no way to go back to where we were, and that this new place is much harsher, the old assumptions do not apply? Thoughts? So this is a little bit of a counter question to the moment of hope that we were at a few minutes ago. So let's see how we handle, and frankly, you know, this is the way my children speak. You know, they see a grim future there. So I think that the strategies and the language we use and the way we address these questions and the way we communicate that we are in fact making some progress is really important. So anyone out there want to take on Barbara's question?
Well,
Yeah.
Kevin, could you ask Barbara to give us an easier question?
I was going to try and jump in on this one because I think this is really a great question and something that we all grapple with. You know, again, going back to my experience in working on river systems, that means I've been all over the world assessing river systems. And so I've seen river systems where you can literally walk on water because they're choked with plastic. So they're not really a river system any longer, right? They're at a point where you think that they're beyond control or beyond helping things. Going to some of the worst trash dumps you can ever imagine in the world and seeing just the abject poverty of the people who live next to these trash dumps. These areas that have such what we think are enormous problems, but at the same time, you see right in those same spaces, people being able to do things. They may be collecting trash and turning it into mats that they can sell that will support something in their neighborhood. It may be a very small scale activity, but it's something that gives people avenues to think about how they can solve some of the seemingly intractable problems in their backyard. So I think it's this very small scale stuff that if we look at enough of those sorts of things, that is a hopeful moment. I'm not going to try to blue sky this and say that all these big problems aren't out there. They definitely are. But, you know, if you've been to places like, you know, some of the poorest places in Africa, you know, somehow they make things work. Somehow everything seems to work. Not for everyone, not every day, but things still function. And so I think thinking about what we can learn from those places is what we need to think about to have the proper, I guess, humility about coming to the education table and sharing these stories with our students.
You know, I think that's important. It sort of, to me, I'm reminded of Blessed Unrest, Paul Hawkins' book, and how he talks about that you can go to virtually any village, any community, any neighborhood, and somebody is working on these problems. You know, some group is getting together in the evening over the table and talking about how can we change this or how can we change that. I think that's something that's very different than where we've ever been. And one could imagine that there could be a certain momentum that could lead us in a positive path.
You know, I'm inclined to agree with that, but I want to make an on the other hand. I think Barbara's question is right. Time is really short. Time is not our friend. And if I look at simply grassroots stuff, every place I've been, I can get very excited and you can go to the toughest cities and so forth, but you find somebody doing something that's really incredibly constructive. On the other hand, what we've come into, I think, is a massive political crisis. We don't have an environmental crisis or a climate crisis nearly as much as we have a political crisis. And I mean politics as defined by who gets what, when, and how, including future generations. And so we've got, this is why we've launched this, the project with Arizona State and University of Denver and University of Colorado and Cleveland City Club and a bunch of other organizations to begin to get, to begin to look at our hardcore at the way we do the public business, particularly where it intersects with issues of justice and environment. And begin to rethink that and begin to build a movement around that. I mentioned the work on the Constitution on future generations. They need to have rights, and those rights need to be incumbent on us to do what is necessary so that they have due process. And you can go down through almost anything, but we need to set the political framework which allows those things to occur that Melinda just mentioned so well. And that framework includes taxes, it includes research, it includes laws, it includes court decisions and so forth that allow this creativity at the local level to flourish. Not just little fires here and there, but a bonfire that reshapes the world in a sustainable direction. That's maybe a really bad analogy right now, but that's all politics. And I think if I had one critique of our movement, it is that we have not done the political work that is necessary. And that's why large chunks of the United States are anti-vaccine and so forth. They're anti-science or anti-environment and so forth. We haven't taken this to that level. So that's I'm on my high horse right now, but that's the direction we have to take our design thinking, to me, is in that political and legal realm and begin to reshape that, because so many of the muddy little footprints of everything that ails us go back to laws and regulations and policies. And back on Melinda's point, and I think the heart of Barbara's question, the public opinion for decades now has shown that people want clean air, they want clean water, they want a solar-powered world, but the bridge that connects those opinions of most Americans and most people around the world with political reality, that bridge has been rendered into a toll bridge, and only the rich get across it, for the most part. And so we have laws that and regulations and subsidies and so forth that reflect the wishes and desires and interests of a very small fraction of 1% of the public. So at the local level, yeah, a lot's going on. At the political level, we have a lot of work to do.
All right, I'm going to read one last comment that came in from Marcy Bidwell of the Mountain Studies Institute that I think might be a sort of decent point for us to bring this discussion to a close. Marcy says, from my perspective as a director, leader, and teacher, we need to practice success at small scales, she said, and at all scales, but at small scales in order to believe we are capable of bigger actions. We need to build hope through taking small steps that embolden us to keep going. Taking steps to restore a small part of an arroyo or wetland gives us a chance to ponder and dream about what else we can do together. And I would say, this comment came in from Marcy, who toured me through a wetlands restoration project at 12,000 feet yesterday. And it was so inspiring to see the work that she and her team were doing in a really difficult environment. And it reinforces this idea. And I said to her, it must feel really good to have accomplished this. And indeed, she said, yes, that idea that these small steps give hope to people. So these small steps like the speaker series give hope to me. I'm glad that we can all get together. I'm really excited where the Wright-Ingraham Institute is at with our new executive director. Lee, you've been great to work with. It's been really easy so far. Well, sort of easy so far. I don't want to. Ted, David, Melinda, you guys have been fantastic. I know that this is a lot of work for a short afternoon. But we thank you very much. I hope you return to join us in June of 2022 for a little teaching. And we look forward to your ideas feeding into the Wright-Ingraham Institute. Lee, anything else from your end before we wrap up?
Oh, well, I could go on all night about what we're talking about, but don't get me started.
All right. Well, I'm going to
Kevin,
thank everyone.
Kevin, can I make a comment?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
My name is David Barkin.
I know who
and
David Barkin is.
You know who he is, but I guess not everyone else does, but I won't, I'll leave it at that. It seems to me that the kind of issues you're talking about, I put a note in the chat. The indigenous communities, both in North America and Canada, the US, but especially in the global South, are people who go about doing this with a different type of cosmovision. And I would urge the whole concept of cosmologies or cosmovision to be included into what you're discussing.
David, without a doubt, I support that view. We've taken the position in this Field Stations program that art and literature and poetry and storytelling are as important as the scientific components. The connection, I mean, that makes it much more real for students. And in fact, there are many stories that can only be told through poetry and art that just don't come across in hardcore. You know, it's really a combination of all. And, you know, I'm thrilled that you're on, David, and it just gives me hope that the Wright-Ingraham Institute is out there and reaching people like you who've done a lifetime of incredible work. Let's try to catch up sometime, please, David.
Right. There's an organization called ICCA Consortium, which you might want to, I'll send you a note about that, Kevin.
All right. Thank you. All right, I'm getting some notes here. Absolute gratitude to Ted, Melinda, Catherine, David. Thank you all for your energy and your insights. And I really, really wish we could all get together right now at the end of this event and say hello and shake some hands, but maybe soon.
Kevin, thank you so much, and to all the staff. It's been a real honor and a joy to be with you.
The honor is all ours. Melinda, David and Ted, you guys are all have incredible bodies of work going, and I know it's a lot to take out time. And again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you,
All right.
everyone. Join
Have
us
a good
next
evening.
month.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.